Hello YouTube, this is Cloud9 Nerd. This is where Zing stands as of the January 1st, 2015 ban list. I will be discussing the pros and cons of the deck before giving my personal opinion. So without further ado, the pros. Let's get started with the monsters. The obvious pros are that all of the monsters, with the exception of Boxia, replace themselves when they're destroyed and sent to the graveyard. This makes them very resilient to OTKs, which are very popular in today's format, and also makes cards like Dark Hole, Torrential Tribute, and Needle Sealing great techs because you can disrupt your opponent's board while still maintaining your own board presence and even furthering your plays, searching out the Zings that you want for that ideal synchro play. Moving on to the spells and traps, we have Zing Path, which is a themed Pot of Avarice. Pot of Avarice being a very good card, putting your Zings back into your deck to reuse them for synchro plays or even just to chump block attacks is great. And drawing cards is always good in this format, in any format. Moving on to the traps, off the top of my head, I can't think of any other archetype that has a card like Zing Creation, which just lets you continually plus and put out monsters on the board turn by turn. On top of that, they have their own limiter removal, and doubling your attack and defense is amazing. A lot of archetypes have Honest or Colute-like cards, but just a straight-up limiter removal that not only can push big damage on your opponent, but gets your monster searches going to further your plays is amazing. And on top of that, this archetype's ability to make powerful synchros more powerful is its bread and butter. Having a card like Yazi or Leo that can't be targeted, be immune to spells, traps, or battle is game-breaking. And a lot of times against the right deck, it just ends the duel right there. Your opponent's going to scoop. So moving on to the cons of the deck, the biggest con that I feel about this deck is its turn 1 play. It has horrible turn 1 plays. You're either sitting a defense monster, summoning a Swanee or Beyond, or, the best case scenarios, you have a Yazi on board and you resolve the path and you have 4 cards in your hand and a Yazi on board, which is not very great, given the other 3 decks, Burning Abyss having double Dante or even 1 Dante. Shadal's leaving a window on board, which by itself stuns, and they could probably set an enemy controller or an L fusion, to stun you even further. Cleese, their standard opening being normal summon Clifford, equip, sacrifice. All these plays are much better than the Zing plays. And what that does is that makes this deck really slow, which is another con. It's very reliant on your opponent. It's very reactive. If your opponent just sits back and, builds their advantage, not attacking your monsters, you could get in trouble pretty quick, especially with the speed that all the other decks are running. And while these monsters do float, they don't float as good as the Shadal's or Burning Abyss or even Cleese. And I say that Cleese float because when they get destroyed, they get put on top of the extra deck, waiting to get Pendulum summoned, and then, Carrier and Helix get their effects when they get tributed off, bringing in cards like Stealth and Disc. But besides that, this deck, I believe, in my opinion, it relies heavily in its traps. Cards like Zing Creation, Call of the Haunted, Brutality, and stuff like that, Torrential Tribute. And that just adds to the slowness of the deck. In this format, a lot of the top decks are just slimming down on traps or cutting them all together, like Shadal's and Burning Abyss. I know Cleese barely run any traps now as it is. Another con of this deck is that it can be resource heavy. A lot of times, to bring out a good, powerful synchro monster, you do need to have several cards on board. And if you're not bringing them out via Creation or Call of the Haunted, you're using a lot of resources to just put 1 monster on board. And if it's not an ideal monster, or if your opponent has an answer to it, it can just straight ruin you and you could just lose the duel just from that. But besides that, this deck is very vulnerable to monster effects. Cards like Construct or Stealth and Virgil can be very damaging to your deck. Sending your monsters back means that they don't float. You can't further your plays, and it puts you 1 turn behind. And the biggest con of this deck is that all your monsters need to be destroyed. And that's a problem because cards like Trevor and Virgil are very popular. Stealth and Carrier bouncing things. Your monsters aren't going to float. They're leaving the field. They're causing you to lose your normal summon. They're putting you back turns. And the other decks are still furthering their plays. So that's it for the pros and cons. In my opinion, this deck is getting a little bit better with a lot of decks cutting their traps out. It means there's less for you to worry about. As far as I was concerned in my testing, one of the biggest things that this deck had a trouble with was Burning Abyss and Wing Blast and Karma Cut. But with them cutting the traps down, you have an easier matchup. You don't really fear anything in their extra deck. The clean matchup is considerably easy, and the hardest matchup of the format would probably be Stellar Knights, simply because Trevere is just Trevere. That card is just awesome. So maybe this deck can be a little more viable. I'm definitely going to be testing this up until Necros comes out. So I really like the deck. It's really fun. But competitive, maybe not so much. As far as competitive plays goes, I'm probably going to be picking up something else. So that's it for my Yang Zings, guys. Stay tuned. I'm going to be talking about Cliff Forts, Stellar Knights, and Necros when they come out. So go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you at the next video.